On March 17, 2026, Israel killed Ali Larijani, a precision strike. No warning, no negotiation. The man who had spent 2 decades protecting Iran's nuclear program from the outside world was gone in seconds. But to understand why Israel wanted him dead badly enough to wait 20 years, you have to go back to Geneva. Spring 2006. Geneva, spring 2006. The courier had been in the building for 9 minutes. He had 4 minutes left. The business center on the second floor of the hotel annex was quiet at that hour. A few delegates from peripheral delegations, a secretary working through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated overnight. The courier moved through the space with the unhurried efficiency of someone who belonged there, which was the point. His cover was legitimate. His professional reason for being in the building was verifiable. The Iranian delegation's administrative staff used this room every morning between 7:15 and 8:45. The courier knew this because someone had watched them do it for 4 consecutive days. The document package was already inside the room. It had arrived before he did. What the package contained, formatted to look like internal Iranian security correspondence, annotated in the bureaucratic style of the Ministry of Intelligence, was designed not to inform, but to infect, to seed a question inside a system already primed for paranoia, to make one of the most powerful men in Iran's security establishment look, to his own colleagues, like a liability. The courier left through the north exit. He did not look at the silver vehicle parked across the street. He already knew exactly which angle its camera could not reach. 40 minutes later, a single signal confirmed delivery. In Tel Aviv, the file moved from active to dormant, but someone else had been watching. And what they captured that morning would become an open file, the kind that produces consequences on timelines no planning cycle can anticipate. How did Israel construct an operation this precise? Who was the target, and what made him worth this level of exposure? And what did it cost the people who made it happen? If you follow intelligence operations at this depth, subscribe now. This channel does not simplify. Now, rewind. By 2005, Ali Larijani was not simply a politician. He was architecture. He was the structural load-bearing wall of Iran's national security establishment. The point where military doctrine, nuclear ambition, and diplomatic maneuvering all converged into a single human decision-maker. Remove him from the equation, and the equation does not merely change, it collapses. He had served as head of Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting for over a decade before moving into the security apparatus, which meant he understood information the way engineers understand load distribution, where it concentrates, where it fails, and how to route it around the places you do not want it to go. When Supreme Leader Khamenei appointed him Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council in 2005, he became Iran's primary interlocutor with the international community on the nuclear file. The man who would sit across the table from European diplomats and say, with complete authority, exactly as much as Iran wanted said, and nothing more. For Israel's intelligence community, this combination of access and discipline made him uniquely dangerous. The Mossad had been tracking Iran's nuclear acceleration since the early 1990s. The pace shifted decisively after 2002, when satellite imagery and a dissident group called the Mojahedin-e-Khalq revealed the existence of a uranium enrichment facility at Natanz and a heavy water plant at Iraq that the IAEA had never been invited to inspect. The disclosure forced a public reckoning that Iran's government managed with characteristic precision. Admit the minimum, negotiate the maximum, buy time. Larijani was the instrument of that strategy. He was not a scientist. He did not design centrifuges or calculate enrichment thresholds. What he did was more operationally dangerous. He designed the political envelope that protected the people who did. He knew which inspections to permit, which delays were defensible under diplomatic cover, and which communications between Tehran and its procurement networks in Europe and Asia needed to disappear from any paper trail entirely. He was the buffer between Iran's nuclear program and international accountability, intelligent, disciplined, and almost impossible to surveil directly, because his security protocols were built by people who had spent decades studying how foreign intelligence services penetrate high-value targets. That was the first constraint. Larijani traveled with layered protection and moved through environments that were, from a technical collection standpoint, essentially closed. His phone communications were heavily compartmentalized. His schedule was known to almost no one in advance, including members of his own staff below a certain clearance level. His habits had been deliberately randomized as a counter-surveillance measure. Western intelligence agencies could place him geographically after the fact. Placing him in advance, with the precision required for any kind of direct action, was a different problem entirely. The second constraint was political geometry. By 2005, Iran was actively engaged in nuclear negotiations with the EU3, Britain, France, and Germany. The United States, under the Bush administration, had declined to participate directly, but had tacitly endorsed the European diplomatic track. Any Israeli operation that created visible turbulence in Tehran's leadership during this period risked being characterized not as a counter-proliferation measure, but as deliberate sabotage of diplomacy. The blowback would not come only from Iran. It would come from Washington and Brussels. The third constraint was proximity. Mossad's operational doctrine for high-value targets inside Iran had been shaped by painful experience. Savama, the Ministry of Intelligence, was competent, paranoid, and had been specifically restructured after the Iran-Iraq War to detect foreign intelligence penetration. Any asset running inside Iran was operating under sustained pressure, and the deeper the access, the shorter the expected operational lifespan, which meant that when a source inside the security establishment, a source the file designated only as Cedar, began producing material that mapped Larijani's actual decision-making process, not his public positions, but the internal architecture of how he thought and what he was protecting, Tel Aviv understood two things simultaneously. First, this was the most valuable human intelligence product they had developed inside Iran in years. Second, it could not last. The question was not whether to act. The question was how much they could learn before the window closed, and whether, when it did close, they would be positioned to do something with it. Cedar had not been recruited in the traditional sense. There was no honey trap, no financial leverage, no ideological conversion over a safe house dinner. The individual, whose precise identity and role within the Iranian system remains officially unacknowledged, had made initial contact through what intelligence historians sometimes call a walk-in with preconditions. The preconditions were specific: no meetings on Iranian soil, no electronic communication through any channel that touched Iranian infrastructure, and no operational tasking that required the source to take active steps inside the security establishment. Observation only, passive reporting. The kind of arrangement that minimizes the source's exposure at the cost of limiting the handler's control. Mossad accepted the terms. When you are offered a window into the Supreme National Security Council, you do not renegotiate the curtain arrangement. The contact had been established before Larijani's formal appointment, meaning Cedar's access predated his value, and the handling structure in Tel Aviv had been patient enough to wait for the position to make the source worth running. That patience was itself a form of discipline. For roughly 2 years following Larijani's appointment, Cedar delivered. The material covered Larijani's communication patterns with the nuclear negotiating team, his relationships with key figures in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and, most critically, a detailed picture of how Iran's leadership internally assessed the credibility of various international threats. This last category was extraordinarily valuable. It revealed, with uncomfortable precision, exactly which pressure points Tehran took seriously and which it had concluded were performative. It was, in effect, a map of Iran's psychological defenses. It also revealed something operationally concrete, a pattern. Larijani maintained a small number of off-protocol meetings, gatherings that did not appear in any official schedule, conducted with a security footprint significantly lighter than his public movements. These were not social occasions. They were working sessions, held in locations chosen for discretion rather than security, with interlocutors whose relationship to the official structure was deliberately ambiguous. The pattern suggested a secondary channel, conversations that Larijani was conducting outside the formal architecture of the Supreme National Security Council, on matters he did not want documented even within the Iranian system. What those conversations concerned, Cedar could not confirm. The source had visibility into Larijani's official orbit, not his private one. But the existence of the pattern was itself actionable intelligence. It meant that under specific, predictable conditions, one of the most protected men in Iran became briefly, measurably less protected. That asymmetry was the operational foundation for everything that followed. The team that began building the plan in the winter of 2005 was small, deliberately so. Operational security at the planning stage is as critical as execution, and the more people who carry knowledge of an operation's intent, the more surfaces exist for that knowledge to travel in directions it should not. The core group included analysts from the Iran desk, a logistics specialist with experience in European-Iranian border environments, and two senior case officers whose names do not appear in any public record connected to this operation. They began not with a method, but with a question. Where does the window exist, and how wide can it be opened without the subject noticing the draft? What they identified, after weeks of mapping Cedar's reporting against open-source data on Larijani's travel and public schedule, was a corridor, not a physical location, a temporal and logistical pattern. Several times a year, Larijani traveled outside Iran for diplomatic engagement, primarily to Geneva and Vienna in connection with the nuclear file. These trips were not secret. They were the visible, above-the-surface expression of Iran's negotiating posture. But foreign travel created conditions that did not exist inside Iran. He was in a different legal environment. His protection detail operated under different jurisdictional assumptions. His communications with Tehran were routed differently than on home soil. More importantly, in at least two documented instances, his off-protocol meeting pattern appeared to replicate itself during these international trips. The same behavioral signature, reduced footprint, non-standard timing, interlocutors outside the official delegation, appeared in cities where Mossad had significantly greater freedom of movement than in Tehran. The corridor was in Europe. The question now was whether they could be in position when Larijani walked through it, and whether Cedar would still be operational when that moment arrived. By early spring of 2006, the answer to the second question was becoming uncertain, and the way it was becoming uncertain would change the shape of everything the advance team was about to walk into. The first sign was small. Cedar missed a scheduled signal window, a specific combination of activity on a publicly accessible platform that served as a passive check-in, the kind of communication that carries no content but confirms that the source is still operational and not under duress. One missed window was within tolerance. Field conditions create noise. Sources get sick. Routines get interrupted. Schedules shift without warning. The second missed window, 8 days later, was different. The handler in Tel Aviv noted it in the operational log without escalating. Escalation triggers oversight. Oversight triggers review. And review, in the middle of an active planning cycle, introduces exactly the kind of institutional friction that causes operations to stall at the moment they should be accelerating. The note read, in bureaucratic language stripped of alarm, source non-responsive, passive monitoring continues, assessment pending. What the note did not say, because the handler did not yet know it with certainty, was that Cedar had almost certainly been identified. Not arrested, not turned, identified, which is, in some ways, the most dangerous state. An arrested source is a closed problem. A source under surveillance is an open one, because you cannot know what the opposition knows, what they are allowing to continue in order to learn more, or whether the intelligence still flowing through the channel has been contaminated at the origin. The handler's dilemma was textbook and paralyzing. Go dark and lose the source permanently, or stay engaged and risk running an operation against a target who may already be reading your mail. Tel Aviv chose a middle path. They slowed the signal rhythm, reduced the information density of any outbound communication, and waited. Meanwhile, the planning team continued working, not because they were reckless, but because the European corridor window they had identified was time-sensitive. Larijani was scheduled for another round of nuclear negotiations in Geneva. The diplomatic calendar, in this case, was the operational calendar. It would not wait for internal uncertainty to resolve itself. The plan that emerged was not an assassination. That distinction matters, and not only for legal or diplomatic reasons. The Mossad's operational objective, as it had been defined through the planning cycle, was not Larijani's death. It was his removal from function, specifically, his removal from the position of Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, at a moment when Iran's nuclear negotiating posture was at its most coherent and its most dangerous. A dead Larijani would be replaced within weeks. A discredited Larijani. A Larijani whose private channel had been surfaced to enough of the right people inside his own system, would do something more operationally useful. He would create a vacuum in Iran's internal trust architecture at exactly the moment when that architecture needed to hold. The method chosen was what intelligence practitioners sometimes call a structured exposure, the deliberate surfacing of information about a target's behavior to audiences within the target's own system, designed to trigger internal investigation, internal suspicion, and internal paralysis. It is slower than a bullet and significantly harder to attribute. It is also, when it works, considerably more durable in its effects. The mechanism required three components working in sequence. The first was documentation. Specific, verifiable-seeming material about Larijani's off-protocol meetings that could be introduced into Iranian intelligence channels in a way that appeared to originate from a domestic source rather than a foreign one. Over the prior 18 months, Mossad's technical collection unit had assembled fragments of this material through signals intercepts, physical surveillance during Larijani's European trips, and Cedar's passive reporting. The fragments did not, individually, constitute proof of anything. Assembled and properly framed, they constituted a question. And in a system as paranoid as Iran's security establishment, a well-placed question can be as destructive as a confirmed fact. The second component was a back-channel delivery mechanism. This was distinct from, and would operate entirely separately from, the physical courier action that would follow later in Geneva. The back channel was designed to move the document material into Iran's intelligence system before the Geneva trip even began. A set of document fragments, carefully formatted to resemble internal Iranian security correspondence, introduced through a third-party diplomatic intermediary whose relationship to both Israel and Iran was, officially, non-existent. Several analysts who have studied the period believe the channel ran through a Gulf state whose interests in destabilizing Iran's negotiating coherence aligned at that moment with Israel's operational objectives. The intermediary carried the material without knowing its origin or its intended destination within the Iranian system. A cutout in the structural sense, not a person protecting an identity, but a process designed to sever the chain of attribution at its most traceable link. The third component was timing. The back-channel material needed to surface inside Iran's system at a specific moment, not before Larijani's Geneva trip, which would prompt Tehran to pull him from the delegation entirely, and not after, when the negotiating round would be complete and the disruption would land in a vacuum. It needed to arrive while Larijani was already in Geneva, conducting the very meetings that the material would appear to corroborate as compromised. The document package would reach Iranian desks at the same moment that a second, physical action in Geneva created a confirmatory trail. A simultaneous pressure from two directions that would make the material inside Iran's system appear to have been validated by events on the ground. That second action was the courier's task.
Understood.
The two delivery mechanisms, the back channel and the physical transfer, were designed to function as a pincer. Neither was sufficient alone. Together, they would make the question the package posed feel less like foreign interference and more like something Iran's own system had surfaced independently. Coordinating these two components across multiple countries through intermediaries operating with partial information against a timeline set by a diplomatic calendar that could shift without notice required a level of logistical precision that the planning team had spent months constructing. And it now depended on a single factor they could not fully control. They needed Cedar to confirm one piece of information: the exact composition of Larijani's Geneva delegation. Not the official list, which was available through diplomatic channels. The actual list, who was traveling under which documentation, which members of his protection detail were accompanying him, and whether any of the delegation's support staff had been changed in the preceding 2 weeks. A change in support staff at that proximity to a scheduled trip is one of the cleaner indicators that a security service suspects internal compromise. If Cedar's reporting showed personnel substitutions in Larijani's immediate travel environment, it meant Tehran had identified a vulnerability and was quietly restructuring around it. It would mean abort. If the delegation was stable, they still had a window. The problem was how to reach Cedar without accelerating whatever process had already caused the source to go silent. The standard signal architecture had been reduced to minimum activity after the second missed window. Using it for an active information request, even a passive-seeming one, risked confirming to whoever might be watching Cedar that the source was still in contact with a foreign handler. It was the kind of move that converts a suspected asset into a confirmed one. So the request went through a tertiary channel, an older fallback method that the source and handler had established at the beginning of the relationship for exactly this kind of low-frequency, high-stakes communication. It was a physical mechanism, not a digital one. A message conveyed through a series of seemingly mundane transactions in a city that will not be named here. Slow, low signature, and almost impossible to attribute to a specific intelligence service, even if intercepted. It took 11 days to reach Cedar. The response took another 9 to return. When it arrived in Tel Aviv, it said what the planning team needed it to say. The delegation was stable. No personnel substitutions. Larijani was traveling with his standard protective detail and the same administrative staff that had accompanied him to Vienna 4 months earlier. The window was open. What no one in Tel Aviv knew, because Cedar could not have known it, was that the stability of the delegation was itself a decision. Tehran had identified a potential vulnerability somewhere in its own system. Rather than restructure Larijani's travel environment and alert whoever was watching that they had detected something, they had left the surface unchanged and placed a surveillance layer underneath it. They were not protecting the trip, they were using it. The operation was walking into a counterintelligence net, and the advance team, at that moment boarding separate flights to Zurich and Basel, had no way of knowing that the confirmation they had just received was accurate in every detail, and dangerous for exactly that reason. Geneva in late spring carries a particular quality of light, flat and precise, the way a laboratory is lit rather than a city. The lake reflects nothing dramatic. The streets around the Palais des Nations are wide and observed, formally and informally, by security services whose interests rarely align. It is a city built for negotiation, which means it is a city built for deception. And the professionals who work its margins understand that every conversation in a Geneva meeting room has a shadow conversation happening somewhere else. The advance team arrived 6 days before Larijani's delegation. 3 individuals, traveling on separate documentation, entering Switzerland through different border points over a 48-hour window. None of them carried anything that would survive a hard search. Their equipment, the kind that does not pass through standard screening, was already in place, positioned through a logistics chain that had been running for weeks, and that touched Swiss territory only at its final link. Their primary task for the first 4 days was not operational. It was observational. They needed to map the actual security environment around the Iranian delegation's expected movements. Not the environment as planned, but the environment as it existed in practice. Security plans and security realities diverge in predictable ways. Protective details develop routines. Advanced scouts choose paths of least resistance. The gap between the plan and the practice is where operations live. What the advance team found over 4 days of methodical observation was largely consistent with prior pattern analysis. The Iranian delegation was using 2 hotels, 1 official, listed with the Swiss authorities, and 1 secondary location whose connection to the delegation was not formally documented. This was standard Iranian operational security for senior officials abroad. A visible footprint and a real one, separated enough to create confusion, but not separated enough to protect against a service with the patience to watch both. Larijani himself moved between the 2 locations at intervals that were irregular in their timing, but consistent in their routing. He was varying the clock, but not the map. This is a common failure mode in protective security, the instinct to randomize the when while neglecting the where, because the where is shaped by physical constraints that are harder to vary than a departure time. On the 3rd day of observation, the advance team identified the secondary location's service entrance as the point of minimum surveillance overlap. Each morning, between the end of one protection shift and the full deployment of the next, there was a window of 17 minutes during which the physical approaches to the building were covered by cameras but not by personnel. 17 minutes is not a long time. It is, however, exactly long enough for a courier who knows which exit falls outside every camera angle. Meanwhile, the back-channel component of the operation was already in motion. The document package, formatted as internal Iranian security correspondence, timed to arrive at specific desks in Tehran while Larijani was conducting his Geneva meetings, had been introduced into the intermediary system 4 days before the delegation's arrival. By the time Larijani landed in Geneva, the material was moving. The questions it was designed to raise were already forming in the minds of people inside Iran's security establishment, who had the institutional position to act on them. What was in the package has never been confirmed publicly. Based on what is known about the period, the most likely contents included intercept summaries connected to Larijani's off-protocol meetings, formatted to suggest domestic collection rather than foreign interception, annotated in the bureaucratic style of the Ministry of Intelligence, along with a set of meeting logs, partially redacted in a way that implied the redactions concealed the identity of a foreign contact. The implication was not stated. It did not need to be. In an environment of institutional paranoia, the suggestion of a question is indistinguishable from the question itself. On the 4th night of the delegation's stay, something in the physical environment shifted. The advance team's surveillance of the secondary hotel noted an anomaly. A vehicle that had been parked in the same position for 2 consecutive observation cycles, long enough to have been rotated out under normal circumstances, remained in place. The license plate had changed. The vehicle had not. It was the kind of substitution a competent surveillance team performs to maintain a static post without triggering pattern recognition in a casual observer. Against a trained eye, it was a flag. The advance team lead sent a single-word assessment back to the handling structure: hostile. Whether the surveillance was Iranian, the delegation's own internal security conducting a sweep, or Swiss, or something else, was not immediately clear. The plan had accounted for Swiss intelligence. It had accounted for Iranian counter-surveillance. What it had not fully accounted for was the specific combination of both. The possibility that Swiss authorities, having detected Iranian surveillance activity around Larijani's secondary location, might themselves escalate their monitoring posture in a way that created a compressed, unpredictable environment precisely when the operation needed space. The handling structure had 48 hours to decide, proceed, modify, or abort. In Tel Aviv, that decision was made by people whose names are not part of the public record. What is known is what they chose. They did not abort. The modification was surgical, not a retreat, a compression. The original plan had built redundancy across multiple delivery mechanisms and multiple time windows. What the handling structure now did was collapse that redundancy into a single, narrower execution sequence. Fewer moving parts, fewer people with active roles, fewer surfaces for the hostile surveillance layer to catch a reflection off of. Two members of the advance team were stood down and extracted from Geneva through separate routes within 24 hours. They left nothing behind, not in their hotel rooms, not in the city's camera infrastructure, not in any transactional record that would connect them to the operation's remaining active element. The logistics chain was similarly trimmed. Equipment pre-positioned for contingency use was abandoned in place rather than recovered, because recovery requires movement, and movement generates exposure. What remained was one individual, one document transfer, and one window of 17 minutes. The courier was not a Mossad officer in the formal sense. The service has always maintained a category of operational asset that exists outside its official personnel structure. Individuals with specific skills, specific access, or specific nationality profiles that make them useful precisely because their connection to Israeli intelligence is, on paper, non-existent.
The courier held a European passport. His professional cover placed him legitimately in Geneva during the delegation's stay, a verifiable presence that would survive a routine check, and had survived such checks before. He had conducted at least 2 prior operations for the service in environments where official Mossad personnel could not move without immediate exposure. He was not young. He did not look like what the movies suggest a field operative looks like. He looked like a man who had learned, over many years and in many cities, how to be entirely unremarkable. That was the skill. Not speed, not strength, the specific, cultivated ability to occupy a space and generate no memory in the people who shared it. His task was precise in its requirements, if not complex in its mechanics. The physical artifact he was carrying, the final link in the delivery chain, distinct from the back-channel material already moving through Iranian intelligence networks, needed to reach a specific individual within the Iranian delegation's administrative staff. Not Larijani, not anyone in his protection detail. A mid-level functionary whose role within the delegation structure gave him access to internal communication channels, and whose personal history contained a detail that Tel Aviv's analysts had flagged as a passive leverage point. A family member living outside Iran, in a country where that family member's residency status was contingent on relationships with authorities who were not unsympathetic to Western intelligence interests. This was not coercion in any direct sense. The functionary was not being threatened. He was being used as a conduit, almost certainly without knowledge of the material's origin or content, through a mechanism that exploited his access rather than his loyalty. The distinction matters operationally. A coerced asset is a compromised asset, unpredictable under pressure, liable to reverse course at the worst possible moment, and carrying the specific psychological volatility of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why they resent it. A passive conduit who does not know he is being used cannot betray what he does not know he is carrying. The transfer point was a business center on the second floor of an annex adjacent to the secondary hotel, a space the delegation's administrative staff used each morning for document preparation and secure communication during the negotiating round. The courier had a professional reason to be in the building that would appear in whatever log the Swiss building management kept. He had been in the building twice before in the preceding 4 days, establishing a pattern of presence that made his appearance on the 5th morning unremarkable. The specific mechanism of transfer has not been publicly documented. What is known is that it did not require direct physical contact between the courier and the functionary. It almost certainly exploited either a dead drop within the shared workspace or a substitution within the document workflow that the functionary processed as routine.
unaware that one item in his stack had not originated where its formatting suggested. The document looked like something that belonged in his pile. It was designed to look exactly like that. The transfer happened on the 5th morning of the delegation's Geneva stay. The courier entered the building at 7:22. He moved through the lobby and took the stairs rather than the elevator, a detail that eliminated one camera angle and added approximately 40 seconds to his transit time, a trade the geometry of the building made worthwhile. He was in the business center for 11 minutes. He left through the north exit, which fell outside the sightline of the vehicle that had been parked across the street for 2 consecutive observation cycles. He did not look at the vehicle. He had been briefed on its camera angle 3 days earlier. Looking would have been the mistake, not the vehicle itself. 40 minutes after he cleared the perimeter, he sent a pre-arranged signal, a specific sequence of activity that meant, in the operational vocabulary of the mission, delivered, no contact, extraction proceeding. In Tel Aviv, the handling structure acknowledged the signal. Channels were closed in sequence. Intermediaries were released from their roles without being told the operation had concluded. The standard practice of a service that does not let its cutouts carry knowledge they no longer need. The file moved from active to dormant status. Not closed because the downstream effects of what had just been delivered could not yet be assessed, but no longer live in any operational sense. The operation, in the narrow technical sense, was complete. What happened next was no longer in Mossad's hands. The document package entered Iran's security establishment not as a detonation, but as a slow leak. This is the nature of structured exposure. It does not produce an immediate, visible result. It produces a climate, a gradual shift in the temperature of institutional trust that is invisible from the outside and often invisible from the inside until it has already done its work. The back-channel material, moving through Iranian intelligence networks since before the Geneva trip began, had already reached the desks of people with the institutional position to ask uncomfortable questions. The physical artifact introduced through the functionary now added a second data point, something that appeared to have been collected on the ground in Geneva, independently of whatever had arrived through the back channel, appearing to corroborate it. 2 independent-seeming streams pointing at the same question. That was the architecture of the operation's final stage. Not proof, not accusation, a convergence that, inside a system already primed for paranoia, would be almost impossible to dismiss. The specific pathway through which the material moved within the Ministry of Intelligence and the Supreme National Security Council's internal oversight structure is not part of any public record. Intelligence services do not publish their internal deliberations, and the Iranian system is among the least transparent in the world about the mechanics of how it processes doubt about its own senior officials. What is known is what happened to Ali Larijani over the following 16 months. But before that accounting, there was one more thing the operation left unresolved, a variable the handling structure had flagged, documented, and been unable to close. The hostile surveillance element in Geneva had been present during the courier's approach to the business center annex. The vehicle with the changed plate and unchanged body. Whether it had captured anything useful, a face, a movement pattern, a timestamp that connected a specific individual to a specific location at a specific moment, was unknown. The advance team members already extracted from Geneva had seen enough to assess the surveillance as professional and patient, which narrowed the field of candidates without eliminating any of them. Swiss intelligence was the most likely primary candidate. The Swiss Federal Security Service maintains a standing surveillance posture around senior foreign delegations conducting sensitive negotiations on Swiss soil, particularly delegations connected to proliferation-adjacent files. It is not aggressive surveillance in the sense of active interdiction. It is observational, archival, the kind of long-form institutional record-keeping that becomes relevant not immediately, but years later, when a case that seemed closed reopens under different circumstances. Iranian counter-surveillance was the second candidate. Tehran's security services, having chosen to leave the delegation's surface structure unchanged while placing a hidden layer beneath it, would have had personnel in Geneva specifically tasked with identifying foreign intelligence activity around Larijani's movements. If that layer had been positioned correctly, if they had anticipated the business center annex as a point of operational interest, they may have had eyes on the courier's approach without the advance team having detected them in turn. The third possibility was a service whose interests in the operation's outcome were not aligned with Tel Aviv's, and whose identity the handling structure declined to speculate about in the operational review documentation that is partially surfaced through journalistic sources. The handling structure's formal assessment concluded with a judgment that would define the operation's legacy within the service. Underscore primary objective achieved. Operation must be considered partially observed. Attribution unconfirmed. Exposure level uncertain.
Thank you.
Uncertain.
We'll be in touch.
In intelligence work, uncertain is not a conclusion. It is an open file.
What is
The
this?
courier was extracted from Switzerland within 72 hours of the transfer. His documentation was clean. His professional cover was consistent. Nothing in his exit processing had triggered any visible flag. But the handling structure understood that a clean exit is not the same as an invisible one. A motivated service with a photograph taken at the right angle, at the right moment, outside the right building, can pursue an identification through channels that produce results quietly and on timelines measured in years rather than weeks. That possibility was documented.
It's in there.
Assessed as manageable given the courier's operational profile. And then the file moved to dormant, and the service moved to the next problem. What the open file could not yet show, what would only become legible in retrospect, was how the operation's two tracks were already producing different effects on different timelines inside Iran's system. The back-channel material had reached Iranian intelligence desks while Larijani was still in Geneva. It had done so through a pathway that appeared domestic, which meant the initial reaction inside the Ministry of Intelligence was not to look outward for a foreign author, but inward for a domestic one. This was the design. A foreign intelligence plant that is recognized as foreign becomes a diplomatic incident and a counterintelligence case that the target institution can manage by looking at its external surfaces. A document that appears to originate from within the system becomes something far more corrosive. It activates the institution's internal paranoia against itself. The investigation that follows does not look outward. It looks at the people in the next office. The physical artifact introduced through the functionary added a different kind of pressure. It was not, by itself, conclusive. Nothing in the package was designed to be conclusive, but it provided a second apparent data point that, arriving through a different channel at roughly the same time, made the first appear less like a fabrication and more like a fragment of a larger truth that the system had not yet fully assembled. The functionary, for his part, almost certainly never understood what had passed through his hands. His role had been structural rather than intentional, a gap in the architecture that the operation had identified and used without requiring his knowledge or participation in any meaningful sense. Whether he was subsequently investigated by Iranian counterintelligence as part of the institutional sweep that would have followed the material surfacing is not known. If he was, the investigation would have found nothing actionable because there was nothing to find. He had been a door, not a source. Inside the Supreme National Security Council, the atmosphere in the months following the Geneva negotiating round grew measurably colder around Larijani's immediate working relationships. This is not documented in any public record. It is the kind of change that surfaces only in retrospect, through the accounts of individuals who were present and who have, in some cases, discussed the period with journalists or academics without specifically identifying the mechanism of the shift. What those accounts describe, in aggregate, is a gradual withdrawal of the kind of informal institutional trust that senior figures in closed systems depend on and rarely notice until it is already gone. The slightly shorter meetings, the information shared slightly later than it used to be, the decisions made in rooms that Larijani was no longer in. It is the texture of institutional suspicion, invisible from the outside, unmistakable from within. In October of 2007, 16 months after the Geneva operation, Ali Larijani resigned as secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. The official explanation, delivered through Iranian state media, was that the resignation was voluntary, driven by strategic differences with President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad over the pace and terms of nuclear negotiations with the European partners. This explanation was not entirely false.
The tensions between Larijani and Ahmadinejad were real, documented in Iranian political reporting from the period, and rooted in a genuine disagreement about how much flexibility Iran could afford to show at the negotiating table without appearing to concede ground that the hardline faction considered non-negotiable. But policy disagreements between senior Iranian officials are common. They do not typically produce resignations. The Iranian system manages internal friction through reassignment, through the quiet redistribution of portfolio, through the kind of bureaucratic displacement that keeps a figure nominally present while removing him from anything that matters. A resignation, a public, formal departure, is a different signal. It is the signal of a figure whose internal position has already been evacuated before the announcement makes it visible. Larijani did not leave in the manner of someone who had chosen his moment. He left in the manner of someone whose institutional ground had been slowly withdrawn from beneath him over a period of months, whose relationships within the security establishment had cooled in ways that were not publicly explained, and whose access to the internal communication architecture of the Supreme National Security Council had been subtly restructured well before his departure became official. Iranian political systems do not remove senior figures through confrontation. They remove them through the gradual withdrawal of access, trust, and the invisible infrastructure of institutional standing. By the time a figure in Larijani's position is publicly gone, the actual removal has been underway for a long time. The question that cannot be answered with precision is how much of that withdrawal was the direct product of the Geneva operation, and how much was the natural friction of Larijani's relationship with Ahmadinejad's faction. Friction that existed independently, and that the operation may have accelerated, amplified, or simply exploited rather than created. Intelligence operations rarely produce effects that are cleanly separable from the political environment they enter. They work with the grain of existing tensions. The operation's contribution was not to manufacture the fracture. It was to find the existing crack and apply pressure at a specific angle, at a specific moment when the crack was most likely to propagate. His replacement was Saeed Jalili. The contrast was immediate, and from Israel's perspective, significant, though not necessarily in the way the operation had explicitly intended. Jalili was a hardliner, whose approach to the nuclear file was ideologically rigid in ways that Larijani's had never been. Where Larijani had understood the diplomatic process as a tool, something to be managed, stretched, and used to buy time and space for the program it protected, Jalili appeared to regard negotiation itself with a kind of principled suspicion. He was less interested in calibrated ambiguity than in declarative position, less interested in the texture of the conversation than in its conclusion. This made him, paradoxically, easier for Western governments to deal with politically, and harder to deal with practically. Easier politically because his inflexibility provided cleaner justification for escalating international pressure. Harder practically because a negotiating partner who is not actually interested in negotiating cannot be moved by the ordinary instruments of diplomatic process. The nuclear talks with the EU-3 deteriorated steadily through late 2007 and into 2008. The deterioration produced the conditions for a broader international consensus, one that eventually supported a significantly stronger sanctions framework than had been achievable while Larijani was managing the diplomatic interface with his particular combination of apparent reasonableness and strategic opacity.
UN Security Council sanctions resolutions passed with increasing frequency and force during this period. The international coalition that Iran had spent years trying to fracture held more firmly than it had before. Whether the Geneva operation caused this sequence or merely contributed to a process already in motion is a question the evidence cannot resolve. What the sequence shows is that the removal of one skilled operator from a complex institutional position does not simply create a vacancy. It creates a reorganization, and reorganizations produce second-order effects that the operation that triggered them cannot predict or control. For Cedar, the Geneva operation was the terminal point of a relationship that had already been compromised before it was used. The source's silence in the months following the operation was not, as the handling structure had initially framed it, a sign of caution or operational disruption. It was the silence of someone navigating the specific, terrible interval between being suspected and being arrested, trying to perform normality under conditions that make normal behavior nearly impossible, because the performance of normality is itself a form of evidence when the people watching you are specifically trained to find the seams in it. Cedar had been able to respond to the final information request, the delegation composition query, routed through the tertiary channel, because that channel's design made it functionally invisible to standard surveillance. It moved slowly, used no digital infrastructure, and left a transactional trace that was, in isolation, entirely unremarkable.
The Iranian surveillance net that had been placed around Cedar was looking for the kind of contact that intelligence services typically use: electronic signals, patterns of movement, meetings with individuals of foreign connection. The tertiary channel produced none of these signatures. It was the operational equivalent of a message hidden in plain sight. And it worked once, under those specific conditions, in a way that could not have been replicated a second time. That single successful communication was the last thing Cedar provided. After it, the silence became permanent. What happened to Cedar is not part of any public record. Iranian intelligence services do not publish their counterintelligence outcomes. The individuals processed through that system under suspicion of foreign contact do not typically surface in documentation accessible outside Iran. The operational file in Tel Aviv, whatever it contains, has not been declassified or leaked in any form that has reached open sources. What the handling structure knew by the end of 2006 was that Cedar was gone. Not in the administrative sense of a source safely extracted and relocated, but gone in the way assets go when the service cannot reach them and cannot establish whether they are dead, imprisoned, or simply unreachable in a country that has decided to keep the answer to itself. The handlers who had managed Cedar's file knew precisely what the source had provided, what the source had risked, and what the silence almost certainly meant. The loss was recorded with the kind of institutional composure that is necessary for a service to continue functioning and that looks, from any external vantage point, like something adjacent to indifference. It was not indifference. It was the specific practice discipline of people who understand that the alternative to continuing, to running the next source, planning the next operation, accepting the next set of unresolvable costs, is seeding a field that does not wait for grief to finish. The damage extended beyond Cedar as an individual. When a source inside a security establishment is identified, the counterintelligence investigation that follows does not stop at the source. It maps outward, tracing every contact, every anomalous communication, every transaction that might indicate additional foreign intelligence penetration. Some traces lead nowhere. Some lead to individuals who had no connection to the foreign service, but whose proximity to the identified source is sufficient to trigger surveillance, reassignment, or worse. The Iranian system's response to the identification of a source with Cedar's level of access would have been thorough and expansive. And it would not have been particularly concerned with the distinction between confirmed penetration and suspected association. The damage radius was, by any reasonable estimate, larger than the source alone.
This cost, distributed across individuals whose identities and fates are unknown, is rarely factored into the public assessment of intelligence operations. The visible outcome is legible. Larijani's departure, the shift in Iran's negotiating posture, the sanctions trajectory. The invisible costs are not. The accounting is permanently incomplete, and the people who carry it know that it is incomplete and continue anyway, because the arithmetic of the alternative is worse and less certain. The broader arc of Iran's nuclear program in the years that followed resists any clean narrative about the operation's long-term effectiveness. Larijani himself did not disappear from Iranian public life. He moved into the role of Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, a position of genuine institutional power, but one structurally separated from the nuclear file and from the direct operational interface between Iran's security establishment and its external procurement networks. He had been elevated in formal title while being distanced from the specific function that had made him operationally significant. His institutional knowledge did not leave the system with him. The processes he had built, the diplomatic playbook his office had refined, the people he had mentored and the mechanics of calibrated ambiguity, these remained, distributed across the system, available to whoever came next. This is the fundamental constraint of any operation that targets a person rather than a process. Persons can be removed. The institutional knowledge they carry cannot be extracted with them. A system that has learned to protect a nuclear program through a specific combination of diplomatic management and strategic opacity does not lose that knowledge when one of its practitioners is sidelined. It relearns, redistributes, and eventually reconstructs on a timeline that the operation that caused the disruption cannot control. The sanctions pressure that developed through 2008 and intensified through the early 2010s eventually brought Iran back to the negotiating table in a different posture. The talks that produced the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015 involved, on the Iranian side, a negotiating team led by Mohammad Javad Zarif, a diplomat whose approach bore a recognizable resemblance to the calibrated method that Larijani had once practiced. The system had, over nearly a decade, reconstructed the skill set that his departure had temporarily disrupted. What the Geneva operation purchased in the end was time, not elimination, not permanent degradation, not the collapse of Iran's nuclear ambitions, time. An interval of reduced coherence in Iran's negotiating posture, during which the international sanctions architecture that would eventually force a different kind of conversation became possible to build. Whether that interval was used well by the governments and institutions that benefited from it is a question that belongs to a different ledger, one that the Mossad neither controls nor, in most cases, gets to evaluate. The operational review that had concluded with the word uncertain remained, in a technical sense, unresolved for years. The hostile surveillance in Geneva, whatever it captured, whoever operated it, never produced a visible consequence for the courier, for the handling structure, or for the service's ability to operate in European environments. The courier continued working. The service continued planning. The open file stayed open, the way open files do, waiting for the circumstances that would make its contents relevant. That is the condition intelligence work produces and sustains. A permanent inventory of unresolved exposure, managed not by resolution, but by forward motion. The next operation displaces the last. The next asset's value is weighed against the last one's cost. The window in Geneva lasted 17 minutes. The window in the broader strategic contest, the interval between what the operation disrupted and what Iran eventually rebuilt, lasted considerably longer. Whether it was enough is a question the operational review could not answer, and that history has not yet resolved with any finality. What the operation demonstrated, with the clarity that only a fully executed plan provides, is the specific kind of damage that a well-constructed question can do inside a system built on institutional trust. No bullet, no explosion, No moment that makes the evening news. Just a document that looked like it belonged, moving through channels that were designed to receive it, arriving at desks occupied by people primed to take it seriously, and doing its work in the dark, over months, in the form of rooms that grew slightly quieter when one man walked into them. The Mossad has a word, not often used in public contexts, for operations of this kind. The word translates, roughly, as erosion. Not destruction, erosion. The difference is time, and time, in this business, is the only resource that actually matters. Here is the question the operation leaves open. Does removing a single skilled operator from a nuclear negotiating structure actually slow proliferation in any measurable way? Or does it accelerate the system's adaptation, producing a more distributed and ultimately less targetable architecture than the one it replaced? The Geneva operation disrupted one man's tenure. Iran kept enriching. But the sanctions framework that became possible in the interval changed the shape of the next decade. Was the disruption worth the cost of cedar? Leave your answer in the comments and tell us which part of this operation you think carried the highest risk. Drop a comment, share your read on it. If this level of operational detail is what you're here for, like the video and subscribe. There's more in the archive and more coming.